Good morning. To start things out, we just want to get a sense of how many people have used public transit. And so, how many people have used public transit in the last week? How many people have used public transit in the last month? And how many people have used public transit in the last year? All right. On behalf of the entire Neuger Communications Group team, welcome to the Common Good Breakfast Series. I am Daniel Edwins, the digital team lead for Neuger Communications Group. For those who are new to Common Good, let me tell you a little bit about Neuger. We are a full-service communications firm. If you're wondering what that means, we tell stories that resonate with audiences that drive people to action. On my team, we do all things digital, such as websites, videos, emails, social media management, and digital ads. Neuger also does print design, market research, media relations, and strategic planning. And we work with companies and nonprofits of all shapes and sizes. I would like to thank EngagePrint for being our silver sponsor. Our colleagues at EngagePrint do a wonderful job, everything from newsletters and brochures to calendars and annual reports. Consider EngagePrint for your next print project. I would also like to thank First National Bank of Northfield for sponsoring a table and our in-kind sponsor, Flight Creative Media, for recording today's event. All proceeds from this event will be donated to the Express Bike Shop, which is a program of Keystone Community Services. I'd like to invite Mary McEwen to come up and share the great work that they are doing.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out this morning on this blustery day. My name is Mary McEwen. I'm president of Keystone Community Services. We're a nonprofit that serves the East Metro area of St. Paul. We provide services for youth, families, and seniors, and we do that at 7 different locations. One of our favorite locations that we work out of is Express Bike. All of you have one of these on your table. An Express Bike is a social enterprise that supports youth employment in St. Paul. And the reason we're here today, and I want to thank Neuger for sponsoring this event and for making us the beneficiary of this event, is that, as you all know, bike is one of the ways that we transport around the Twin Cities. And we have been in the business of bikes for over 22 years. We take recycled bikes, people drop them off at our shop, and then our youth, through our employment program, learn how to recycle, refurbish, and sell those bikes to the public. And all the proceeds from Express Bike go back to support our youth employment program. And it's very important in St. Paul because young people, particularly young people of color, really don't have access to first job experiences. I think all of us can remember our first job. You know, what it felt like to be 16 years old. You have that job either washing dishes, or in my case, I was a waitress at a little ice cream shop. For many of our young people, this job at Express Bike is their first job. It's their first opportunity to try and make some money and to learn about what it means to work in the workplace. So we make a special effort to reach out to young people that need a little extra help, that need some other kinds of training and support to have a good professional first job experience. And it's really important for us and for our community that we have these kinds of resources. And it's also important that we have a bike shop like Express Bike that not only provides used bikes to our community, we sell them to all kinds of people, young people, college students, people that are looking for commuter bikes to be moving around and getting to and from work and to and from their errands. But it's also a way that we recycle. One of the things that we do is we recycle all of the parts, we recycle all of the things that come and that we take off the bikes and put back on the bike. So it's kind of a whole full service network in terms of providing youth employment as well as providing that recycling piece. So I just want, if you get a chance, stop in at our bike shop. We're on Selby Avenue in between Lexington and Hamlin, and meet one of the youth that supports our youth program and that gets the benefit of that first job experience. And again, I'd like to thank Neuger for having us here today and for us to be the beneficiary of this event. Thank you.
I'll just give a recap of our intro. Thank you, Mary. I am really passionate about transportation, so I'm excited that we have 4 excellent people on stage to talk about this subject. This passion developed while I was living in Budapest, where they have buses, trolley buses, trams, subways, funiculars, commuter rail, and trains. The busiest tram line in the world circles through the city, and during peak times, a tram comes every 2 minutes. And if I never had to think about if I could get someplace, instead I would think about which of the many ways I wanted to take. Just think about this for a second. What if we all had many options for getting around? And what if public transportation came every few minutes? In contrast, this past weekend I was in Houston, and they've built massive freeways and added lanes to fight congestion, but the traffic is still very bad. With rising inequities, congestion, and global temperatures, we're at a crossroads. Do we want to become more like a Budapest or more like a Houston? We know what a car-dominant system looks like because that's what we're living today. But what would a comprehensive public transportation system look like? And what does it take to change our current behaviors? I'd like to introduce Laura Monn Ginsburg, our moderator. She is the owner and principal of Apparatus, a full-service public policy and affairs practice. She also co-created the Here to There podcast, which explores transportation stories and policy in the Twin Cities. If this discussion piques your interest, I highly recommend you listen to the Here to There podcast to hear interesting stories and discussions about what's happening with transportation in the Twin Cities. With that, I'll turn things over to Laura.
Anything? Oh, there we go. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here on an early Tuesday morning. It's great to be here with you. Thank you for that introduction, Daniel, and thanks to Neuger for putting on a great conversation today. So, as Daniel mentioned, my name is Laura Monn Ginsburg, and I, along with my partner, Layli Fatahi, run a public affairs firm. And we have been focused on transportation for a while now, and in our podcast that we recently put out, we looked at everything from the individual experience of somebody trying to get from here to there every day, whether that's using transit, using cars, using their feet, and extrapolating that all the way up to the policies that shape the options that we have available to us. So when we're thinking about today's topic of moving beyond gridlock, we're going to be talking about that both in the literal sense that some of us may be familiar with as we get around the Twin Cities, but also in that bigger sense of the gridlock that we're seeing at a political and policy level. So to get started, I would like to introduce a fabulous panel. Good morning, panel. Starting to my left with Will Schroeer, the Executive Director at East Metro Strong, which is a public-private partnership of businesses, cities, and counties that work together to bring more and better transit investment to the East Metro in order to catalyze job growth and economic development opportunities. Good morning, Will. And Mary Morse Marti, the Executive Director at Move Minneapolis, which is the Downtown Minneapolis Transportation Management Organization, which advocates for and promotes a sustainable transit and transportation system that supports a vital and growing city. And you may also know Mary from her work as a founder of the original car-sharing platform here in Minneapolis, Our Car, which is still alive and thriving. Love that Our Car. And last but not least, Jonathan Weinhagen, President and CEO of the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce, an organization with over 1,000 members and representing communities throughout the entire 13-county metro area. Good morning, panel. So let's get started with just a fun question of what's your favorite way to get around the Twin Cities?
We were prepped with this, so I had my Nice Ride bike share key ready to go.
Love that Nice Share.
This is a hard one. I really like to walk, but I also, after starting Our Car and deciding that bike share was never going to work, and then it really, really worked, and then I finally joined Nice Ride. So biking, walking, transit, train, bus, express bus especially, and Nice Ride.
Could you repeat the question? So for me, it's situational. Downtown Minneapolis, I'm hoofing it all the time, or leveraging the train to get those few blocks really, really quickly. but I live in the suburbs, so my reality, each and every day is that I hop in my single occupant vehicle and come into downtown Minneapolis. Oftentimes meetings take me all across town, and it requires me to be in a car.
Fair enough.
She's going to push me off the stage.
She just might. Okay, well, let's start with just a quick baseline, and I will, oh, everybody can see, I think. So we do have a great transit system here. We have a great and thorough transit system if you're not aware of it or don't use it on your own regularly. So our Metro Transit system was founded in 1967. We have, it may surprise you, it surprised me, 132 bus routes, 1 bus rapid transit line, 2 light rail, and 1 commuter rail. And for those of you that didn't raise your hand for having taken transit in the past week, one thing to consider is that Metro Transit is currently averaging 266,916 rides each weekday. So even if you didn't take it, that's quite a lot of people that are taking it. As you can see, the funding for Metro Transit comes somewhat from its fares and advertising revenue, but then the rest does come from regional, state, federal, county, and then other sources. So the current legislative session was a bit of a doozy, and I won't take Jonathan's thunder because he's going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But it's something that's been consistently tough in Minnesota, especially compared to some states that can't seem to throw enough money at their transit systems right now, including very, very red cities like Dallas and Salt Lake City and Indianapolis. So, starting with a baseline of what we have in place right now, Mary, I'm going to kick it to you and ask, how are we doing compared to other metro areas?
I think Minneapolis and the region are doing very well with what we have to work with. Metro Transit was named the Transit System of the Year last year. I believe it was by APTA. Mm-hmm. And that was for good reason. They have put together a tremendous multimodal system. They have bike racks on every single one of their buses. They have our car at many of their platforms and stations and stops. They serve a wide variety of suburban areas. If you've ever looked at the map you can get at metrotransit.org, there are park and rides in every suburban location and almost in some exurban locations. They really do serve everyone, and that is quite spectacular given, again, what they have to work with. The system is clean. It runs beautifully. We just need some more people to discover it.
So since we are in downtown Minneapolis right now, and since you work for downtown Minneapolis's TMO, can you speak specifically to some opportunities that you see for us to improve usage in Minneapolis?
Yes. Our whole role at Move Minneapolis is to create a new norm around using transit and non-SOV transportation, SOV being single occupant vehicle. So we're out there trying to help people understand that not driving alone doesn't mean you don't have the resources to do so, or that you're too important to do so, or that it's hard or even scary, because really it's mostly none of those things. And I, as a wealthy white woman, am out using transit, biking and walking constantly, and I tell you, the freedom it offers me is unparalleled. I can get around no matter what the weather is, what day of the week it is, whether I'm disabled or not, whatever my budget is, the transit system allows me to do that really comfortably. So creating these new norms is what we need to do downtown.
Great. So Will, from the perspective of our twin city, can you speak to some things that are going well or some opportunities in St. Paul?
Sure, although I'd like to start by tagging on Mary's response by noting that Metro Transit does a ridership survey every year. Last year they had 90% rider satisfaction, and because this is my job, I was curious how that rated against other similar organizations, and I wasn't clear if I should look, and there's, of course, a national standards organization that tracks these things, right, because there's such a thing for everything. But they have different categories. There's consumer services, there's government, there's, and the post office ranks very low, et cetera. And I wasn't sure if Metro Transit was a transportation service, a consumer service, a government service, right? No matter what category I put them in, they beat the average substantially. So they are doing, as a government, fantastically. As a consumer-facing organization, fantastically. As a transportation provider, fantastically. So I would just underline everything Mary said, but also underline if you do it, and I saw so many hands, so you probably know this firsthand. If you ride it, you're going to be satisfied. So if you can, one of my jobs is to talk about the East Metro opportunities here. So this is a map of our transit ways today, and Mary talked about the bus system, which is a much denser map serving really every community in the metro. But these are the in-operation and planned transit ways. That means either a light rail or a dedicated busway in the region. And the solid lines are in operation today. So you see the blue line going between downtown and the airport and the mall, the red line picking up from there and going all the way down to Lakeville, and then the green line coming over to St. Paul. One of the origins of East Metro Strong was noticing that there were more solid lines headed west than there were headed east, and so we wanted to come together and kind of take responsibility for remedying that situation. But I'm glad to say that we now have a locally preferred alternative, which is all of the local governments and their elected officials in the affected communities voting for the preferred alternative to go north out of downtown St. Paul along the Rush Line, to go east out of downtown St. Paul along the Gold Line, and to go southwest to the airport along Riverview. So we're moving on all of those areas, and under another question, I'm going to show the success of the recent A line in St. Paul, which is very exciting as well. So a lot of opportunities, and I have to say those projects are substantially backed by our colleagues in Minneapolis and in the western suburbs, because they see them as regional economic growth drivers, not just for eastern part of the metro, but for the whole metro.
Great. So Jonathan, keeping in mind that we don't have 3 hours, can you talk a little bit about how we ended the legislative session?
We don't have 3 hours? No. Absolutely. So I'll start with the positive. The largest investment in transit and transportation in a decade, right? So I think for those of us who are really heavily engaged in the legislative session and kind of the sausage making of getting to that point, it was a little bit of a messy couple of months, particularly with regards to the transit and transportation investment bill. On transit in particular, we started from a starting point that could have projected about a 40% cut to our existing bus service. So we've always known that in our state there's kind of been this partisan political divide around something like light rail, a little bit of a lightning rod issue, and we could probably survey everybody in this room with regards to whether or not you think there are merits to fixed rail infrastructure, and get a pretty varied response from the group. This was the first time that really that bus service, kind of the backbone of our transit infrastructure, felt like it came under attack. And that was coupled with a number of policy provisions that were littered across legislation that would have really stymied the ability for the metro area and metro region to continue to build out the system that Will walked us through a minute ago, from kind of a moratorium on rail investment to several other, what we were referring to internally as poison pills that really challenged our ability to build out the system that we believe we need, not to be competitive just regionally, but to be competitive against markets across the country for talent and capital investment. So a lot of work behind the scenes to close the gap, ended with, again, the largest investment that we've seen in transit in a decade. We were able to close the gap, return bus service to 100%. There's a structural deficit around metro mobility, a federally mandated service that Metro Transit has to provide. So for the biennium, Metro Transit is whole. That structural deficit has been kicked down the road. So in our next budget conversations, we're going to revisit the exact same conversation, and we anticipate that it will only grow. But some of the highlights, the County's Transit Improvement Board, which was formed with 5 counties, really with the objective of building the Green Line initially, kind of served its purpose and reached, you could argue, an end of life. made the decision to dissolve for the greater good of our transit infrastructure system. CTIB was levying a quarter-cent sales tax to build out the system that we were building. The legislature allowed CTIB to dissolve and created some parity so that metro counties could levy the additional quarter-cent tax that the other 82 counties across the state have been allowed to levy, which means that we now have the capital infusion between Ramsey and Hennepin County, who have already made the move from the quarter-cent to the half-cent to make the capital investment to build 6 lines. We have the resources to build 6 lines that are in the pipeline. Still some questions with regards to operating expense and whether or not the state will kick in on operations. Traditionally, the state has provided a 50% operating share to our lines, the green line and the blue line in particular. On Southwest, very specifically, the legislation calls out that the state will not contribute to the operating costs. So that's something that we have to figure out as a region. How do we fund the operations of these systems as we build them?
Great. So, Will, do you think that transit advocates can rest on their laurels?
Well, it's an interesting situation to be in because, as Jonathan says, it was sort of the best of times, worst of times last session where we've been trying a long time to get that half-cent to build out this system. We have it. That's a huge win. At the same time, unprecedented attack on the bus system. So really, from a little bit out of left field, we got some press because Jonathan and I ended up going out to suburban park and rides to tell people that their service was likely going to be cut. And had some very, very interesting conversations with these folks. This is a picture I took of, hardworking people going to downtown Minneapolis to work, and this bus would have been taken out of service, literally, under the proposal that passed both the House and the Senate. And A, they didn't know that that was the case, so they were pleased to be informed. And B, we heard a lot of really interesting stories. People going, of course, to work at Target, people going to work at the university. We talked to a legal secretary, a single mom living in Minnetonka because that's where she wanted to live. She could do that because of this bus service, right? So it supports a regional kind of quality of life and economic vitality that I think the folks that voted for those bills maybe didn't entirely understand. So as Jonathan said, the deficit was postponed for a couple of years, but we absolutely cannot rest on our laurels. I guess I would back up a little bit to the bigger picture, too. We had sort of a non-transit advocate, which is incidentally a word I'm not wild about, but I feel like we're all advocates for regional quality of life and health and just a nice place to live and letting people go to work, right? But beyond ourselves, we have the Amazons of the world, not only the Amazons, saying, don't have a transit system, not going to come. We have employees saying, don't have a transit system, not going to come. The folks that do these kinds of surveys every year, Urban Land Institute, et cetera, millennials pick where they want to live first, and then they go there and then they find a job. And 1/3 of them, 1/3 of the talent that this region needs nationally says, first, I look for an area with good transit. First. And you don't have it, I'm not going to go. So if we don't have better transit, and believe me, we do pretty well, and I'm not undercutting the fantastic efforts that Mary talked about, but we do not stack up with many of our competitors, and people know that, and we're kind of cutting ourselves off at the knees if we don't improve our system.
Great. So that's a good segue into talking about some things that are changing the conversation. One of which certainly being technology and different systems that have come into place. Obviously, we've got the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. We have driverless cars that, will it, won't it be here sooner than we think? I think at least we can all agree that we're seeing tests and trials and consumer-ready technology that is hitting the roads. And, when you think about something like Metro Mobility that Jonathan referenced, I think that there are some really great opportunities to rethink some of the systems and processes and services that we have that can be more efficient, can gain from technology. Obviously, I'm a big fan of podcasts, and if you are too, I would highly recommend this week's episode of This American Life that just came out on Sunday. It's actually all about travel and has some nice stories in it. But the final story is a first-person narration of a woman with a disability living in New York City who uses New York City's equivalent of metro mobility every single day. And she talks about what she faces using a system that is inflexible and inefficient and somewhat unreliable. And when you think about the ways that we could plug in technology, perhaps using a driverless car that chauffeurs a trained caregiver versus having a bus with a bus driver, using technology like what Uber and Lyft uses both for requesting a ride as well as for prioritizing routes to be faster and more direct. There are ways that we can improve our systems tremendously. And that's just one small example, but you can see how the impact could be big, and especially when we're thinking about shifting demographics, whether it's millennials and what they may be changing in terms of what they're looking for in a city to live in, but also thinking about the fact that we have 10,000 people every day turning 65 in the United States for the next 19 years. So we're looking at different expectations of where do I live, how do I get around, what are the amenities available to me if I want to stay where I am or I want to stay working where I work. So there is this conversation that we need to start having that's a different conversation, and it's not just the words we're using, but it's the people that we're inviting to the table, and having a spectrum of diversity in many different respects so that we are actually getting those voices in when we're thinking about what our next steps look like. So Jonathan, I know that this is something that's been an initiative at the Chamber as far as how do we bring diversity, and not just racial diversity, which is I think where a lot of our minds go, but real diverse perspectives to the table, and how could that be something that we could bring to a conversation like transit and transportation?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. Diversity is really important, and it's something that my organization's board has made a real commitment to. Certainly, racial diversity is one of the most prevalent parts of the conversation. As I look out at this wonderful audience, take a look to your left and to your right. We don't have a lot of racial diversity in this room. I don't have a lot of racial diversity around a lot of the tables that I'm sitting at. But as we look at our future demographics, as we look at our youth population, age birth to 25 in the metro area, counties that have global majority minority youth populations. Will's heard me say this 100 times. I've never been the smartest guy in a room, and sitting with these two can certainly attest that I'm not right now. But I can look at that data set and tell you that an 8-year-old today is going to be 18 in a decade. And are our boardrooms and break rooms ready to accept that talent? And as importantly, are we inviting diverse folks to the table to be part of the policymaking conversation? So whether it's racial diversity, whether it's diversity of socioeconomic, as we think about building a robust multimodal transportation system that is going to drive our region's economy for the next generation, it can't be a bunch of folks who look and sound the same way, sitting around tables, forecasting what our needs are. Some of the things that we're doing to break down those barriers are really looking at how do we, within the ecosystem that we operate, the business community, do much more intentional outreach and engagement, particularly to communities of color and business owners of color. Minneapolis is an incredibly diverse community. Somali immigrants, first-generation Somali immigrants, are the fastest growing segment of entrepreneurialism in the city of Minneapolis. And 6 weeks ago, we could count with no hands the number of Somali immigrants who were informing the work that we do, who were a part of the conversation around transit advocacy, around workforce advocacy, around affordable housing advocacy. So thinking about how do we as an organization be more reflective of the community that we serve, that's going to require breaking down some barriers and some systems. We're a 136-year-old organization that looks and sounds almost exactly the same as we did over a century ago. My board has made a commitment to be the most diverse chamber in the state of Minnesota in 6 months, and we're going to do it. That doesn't mean, for those of you who are active in this community, we're going to call and invite Ravi Norman to be on our board. He's already on our board. A few tokenistic board members is not reflective of board diversity. It really has to start at the ground level. It has to be intentional outreach with our small business owners, our minority business owners across the region, inviting them in to to our work, inviting them to the table, and then we can begin having conversations about leadership and opportunity. But that very first step is we need to diversify our membership, taking a very intentional approach to do that and breaking down some of the systems that we have in place. And I think it's going to, as we talk about kind of the future of transit and transit advocacy, it's going to really reposition our organization in the conversation to be much more reflective of the community that we're building this system for.
Great, thank you. So Mary, we've seen ridership numbers fluctuate, and of course they will fluctuate probably forever. But one of the main catalysts to up years is when gas prices go up, right? And people look for an alternative to driving every day and parking and whatnot. How can employers can kind of take advantage of that and maybe be an effective catalyst for not just short-term change while gas prices are higher, but helping to introduce people to a different way?
Right. I think I mentioned this earlier, but employers have a real leadership role in setting these new norms around transportation. So an employer who you see 5 days a week normally can say, oh, look, we now have a transportation benefit as part of your benefits package. This is a pre-tax benefit to you, so it helps you actually pocket more cash in every paycheck. It's also tax beneficial for an employer because they don't pay payroll taxes on that piece. So as part of our normal employer benefits package, you can have this very inexpensive access to 100% transportation payment all the time. And there's a slide up here.
Oh, yes, sorry. Just go backwards. Yep.
There we go. This piece, I'm not sure how many people think about it this way, but your mode choice can indeed make you a millionaire. If you start taking the bus, if your employer offers you MetroPass, which is what we use here in the Twin Cities, if you have a MetroPass, that's going to cost you anywhere from nothing all the way to $996 a year. That gives you full access to trains, buses, light rail, heavy rail, North Star. And you take that money and you think, that's the money I spend every year. You would pay $8,500 a year in cash depreciation to have a car and to drive it downtown or wherever you're going every single workday. That's $8,500. You can't get away from that. You can do the numbers, go to AAA every single year to have your car. That does not include your parking. So take that money, $8,500, save it, scrape the nails, save it when you're young. You probably don't make much money, but it's not a lot as you get older and make more. Put it in a 5% investment vehicle every year for 40 years. You have $1 million. It was painless. So employers can tell their employees that message, share that message. It keeps cars off the road. It keeps air quality way better than it would be if those cars were on the road. Congestion drops. This is what an employer can do. Make it easy for your employees to use transit, to walk, to bike, to think about living near a park and ride rather than, building way, way, way out. Some of the reason people build way out in an exurb or even create a new community is because it's so expensive to live in the core. Not because people don't want to, it's just expensive. Save $1 million, get a MetroPass.
Well, who knew we were going to get some really sound financial advice today, too? This is great. So, Will, can you talk a little bit about what we saw in the recent release of the Met Council's onboard survey and how can we be leveraging that in the conversations that we're having and in more effective planning?
Sure. Thanks very much. Well, I already gave, for me, one of the big bullets, which was the 90% customer satisfaction rate. But and I just have to compliment Laura here for putting this panel together and preparing these questions. And nobody wants 3 giant slide decks at 7:30 in the morning. So we have just a couple of slides ready to go here. Because of the way that Metro Transit collects fares, and they're standard in this, you can tell a lot about ridership from some of the electronic records, but to get really good origin and destination data, you have to interview people, right? Because your ticket, fortunately, in my view, doesn't say where you live, and Metro Transit has no interest in knowing that. But yearly, they do talk to people and take more detailed ridership surveys and find out where people live and where they're going, et cetera. Helps them do planning, and it also helps inform conversations like these. And I find this kind of thing fascinating. So this is the Route 4, which is one of Metro Transit's heavier used bus lines. And as you can see, it serves quite a variety of communities, north to south. And this is the home address of riders on the Route 4. And you can see that it serves a lot of people, and I would call it a regional service, not just a Minneapolis service, right? These are the blue and green lines, and really drawing from all over the region. And the interesting thing about detailed data like this is it supports a lot of different kinds of analysis. My big takeaway is that the high quality and the regular reliability of those lines makes them draw people from all around the region and serves a wide variety of trip purposes. And so when we talk about, Jonathan mentioned the lightning rod around light rail, and can't we just serve all these trips with buses, et cetera. I just think this is a fascinating set of data to put up in response to that. Now, I would never criticize this line for, quote, only serving people that live within walking distance, right? That's a certain kind of service. I would never criticize the light rail line for costing a lot of money because why? It serves a completely different purpose. Now, you can do a similar set of maps for different kinds of street infrastructure, right? Nobody criticizes the interstate for not carrying the people that live on it because that's not its purpose. Similarly, you don't criticize Hennepin Avenue for not carrying Texas to Canada truck traffic. That's not its purpose. Different kinds of infrastructure serve different kind of trip purposes, and when we collect regional and state funding to support these kinds of lines, just as we do we collect regional and state funding to support different kinds of highways, it's because they serve a regional purpose, and I just really find the ridership interviews fascinating and showing that people from the suburbs are using these lines substantially to get to work and get around.
Yeah, I think this data is really fascinating to see these heat maps of just how far. I mean, I don't know about any of you, but I certainly did not expect to see it be this wide a swath. So I think that's really impressive.
Just because I have the clicker, I'm gonna go back to Laura touched briefly on one of the most popular subjects of these kinds of gatherings, which is the role of the autonomous vehicle in the future. And I just have to put a plug in for basic physics and geometry here. 60 people on this bus, if they all go into 60 autonomous cars, there's not room. There is not room. And we're never going to afford the room to put all of these people in 60 individual cars, even if they're platooning bumper to bumper. And that's just the reality of it. So is there a role for them to provide medical services and chauffeur a nurse instead of a bus driver? Absolutely. I can't wait for that day. That's a brilliant use for that technology. Not a brilliant use, putting all these people who are already doing work, listening to music, studying for their GMATs in an autonomous car.
And I think that's where you have to be, you being largely governmental bodies, being very intentional about what are the outcomes we want to see.
That's
because
exactly.
It's very easy to imagine that the outcomes could be drivers of further inequity and segregation and lack of opportunity if they are allowed to completely come in and we just hope that they're going to solve all of our problems. So I would agree with you that they are fabulous potentially, but not a panacea for our day-to-day issues. So that transitions us into our kind of last big discussion point here, which is a big one. Everybody hold on, I hope you've got fresh coffee. But I want to talk about, and you've all already addressed this, so this isn't an elephant in today's room, but it is an elephant in the transportation room, which is equity. In every conversation that we had in planning for today's panel, this was a discussion point that came up organically among all of us. I know when we were doing the podcast and we were talking to both policymakers and advocates and future thinkers and individuals and residents of our Twin Cities, I was surprised at how much affordable housing, for example, came up in lockstep with transportation issues. So, roads and highways are often touted as being this essential part of the American dream, and they connect us and give us the opportunity to get to places that we might not otherwise have been able to venture. But they've also been rightly seen as a way that we keep each other away. And we've seen interstates that have gone through different areas of the United States very intentionally, going through different pockets and communities and places with less perhaps political capital. The Rondo community in St. Paul comes to mind. I-94 went right through the middle of it, and there's now a great initiative underway to try to physically reconnect that space with a land bridge that would go over I-94. But that's, 50 years after the fact. So, thinking about kind of these bigger implications of transportation, I want to pose to all of you, and Jonathan talked about this a little bit with the chamber already, but how can that thoughtful and inclusive and progressive approach to transportation really help to ameliorate some of these systemic segregation and inequity issues? Does anybody care to start?
Yes, Will, how can we do that?
Well, I'll start with, the narrative around this sometimes gets a little bifurcated. On the one hand, transit is just for poor people who can't afford a car. No, wait, it's only rich people who want this sort of, Laura and I, when we were talking, we both used to live in the same neighborhood, and it was the 6 bus goes from that neighborhood to downtown, and the Target Express, right? It's full of people in red shirts, right? They could all afford a car. I'm glad they don't, because Hennepin Avenue would be utterly impassable if all of those folks decided to do that, but they could all afford a car, and so it's not really a social service, right? Which is it? Well, those are interesting questions to talk about. I think it's not, it's easy to get bogged down in those, wait, it's for the poor, no, wait, it's for the rich, no, wait, it's for, the legal secretary who lives in Minnetonka and takes the 673 downtown. I prefer to think of it as, is there a $10,000 or an $8,500 a year admission fee to the professional or to the working class, right? Because if the only way that you're getting to work is owning a car for every person in the family, that's a $8,500, $17,000 a year, right? If you have multiple working adults in the family, if that's the admission fee to our workforce, that's a big admission fee. And we're going to lose out on any number of people from whatever socioeconomic class they come from. Maybe they're a relatively wealthy person but has a lot of educational loans, right? They're going to go someplace where they don't have to necessarily pay that. Now, not everybody, right? And the other trap, one of the many, many traps we fall into is talking about in broad swaths. Well, most people do X or everybody does Y, right? There are a lot of different kinds of people out there. That needs to be part of our conversation around equity and diversity, and making it possible for a lot of different kinds of people in a lot of different kinds of life situations to take a lot of different kinds of transportation and choices. I actually kicked a little when I was told we were going to be asked to name our favorite transportation choice, because it kind of puts you in a box. Well, he held up a Nice Ride key as his favorite. It's a lot of fun to take a Nice Ride. Do I take it a lot? No. I do whatever the trip purpose at the time requires. We have cars. We have bikes. I have a Metro Pass. I have a Nice Ride key. I have an Hour Car card, right? It's like asking, what's your favorite restaurant? Well, he only eats at McDonald's. That's ridiculous. Of course we do different things. And the vital city, the one that welcomes people from a lot of different walks of life and lets them move through those walks of life, is the healthy city. There was a time I didn't own a car. There was a time a lot of people are not going to own cars, not because they're anti-car, but because that's the stage of life they're in, and they're, guess what, going to get back to that stage of life. I'm terrified when my parents drive, and I cannot wait until they live on a transit line, and we don't have to have this argument all the time, right? So we're getting down to the end here, so my kind of final plug to you is don't think in those broad swaths. See, I need another cup of coffee. Think about a lot of different kinds of people. We're a big region, we're a growing region, we're getting more diverse. That's good for us, and even if you don't think it's good for us, it's a fact, right? Help those people become part of our civic and economic life by not putting up a big barrier and by letting them move in and out of whatever choice is appropriate for them at the time.
Here, here. Here, here. It's all about choice. It's, Will, I'm just going to repeat what you said. I don't know what the word is. I'm not going to mansplain it. I'm going to something. It's multimodalism. When I founded Our Car, and this was a long time ago, we started thinking about it in 2002. It was very, very disruptive. And nobody thought it would work. Nobody thought at the time that anyone would not want to own their own car. Why would you want to share a car with other people? It's going to be vandalized. It's not going to work. Well, it worked. The bugs are still being worked out. Like, how do people want to use it? Is one way the best way? Is round trip the best way? What happened to the car to go? What's going on with Zipcar? What happens when autonomous cars arrive? The only efficient way to use a piece of private property like that, and I think of cars as private property. Every day, if I drive downtown, I realize I'm bringing a 3,500-pound, 84 square foot piece of personal property downtown, and I'm leaving it in a parking ramp, which is in the center of the densest, most valuable real estate in the state of Minnesota. Think about that. It's a lot of real estate that we're taking up with private property when we could have just people coming in. If it's autonomous vehicles, fine, but please let's consider always sharing them, using them efficiently. And specifically to the equity piece, we're all employed, I think, probably. Our employers probably offer a transit benefit to us, and if not, when they find out about it, they will. But I'm not so sure that the lower earners in our city or region have access to some of these perks. It's possible, but I don't know. Does the Subway sandwich artist who makes your sandwich every day have MetroPass? Is it fully subsidized? I don't know. That is really an important part of the conversation. That's the piece of equity. Things we take for granted may not be available to the people who need them the most. So the opportunity may already be there, the mechanism may already be there, but we don't know if it's available. And the last piece is this thing. I've been watching Columbus, Ohio, because not because it's special in any way, but because Columbus built all of its parking out and built housing and business on all of its surface lots and realized all of a sudden that it truly did have a parking problem. Minneapolis has plenty of parking capacity. Sometimes it's a little further than people are comfortable walking, but we have plenty of parking capacity. But in Columbus, they didn't. And so they took a look at what they were doing, and they had a terrible usage rate for transit. They had a 6% rate of people taking transit. In Minneapolis, it's 40%. So they had the 6% rate of transit use. And they said, what are we going to do? We can't attract people downtown. We can't get people to park for our businesses, and employees can't find places to park on those days they need to drive in. So they are subsidizing transit passes for everybody in the downtown business district. It's a 43,000 free pass program, half subsidized by their equivalent of the downtown council and half paid for by other businesses and foundations and other fundraising. It's a pilot project. They're going to launch it in June. It fascinates me. They have 6%, we have 40%. I don't know if that would take our 40% mode share for transit up to 60%. If it did, it's a cheap investment with huge payoff. So we should consider that.
I like it.
I'll bring it back to the original question a little bit. We have deep race relations challenges in this country. They manifest themselves in our region, and transit and transportation in particular have historically played a role in this. A year ago, I spent some time with a delegation on the intercity leadership visit that's hosted in partnership with the Minneapolis and St. Paul Regional Chambers of Commerce to Baltimore. And one of the things we talked a lot about was structural racism and the role that transit and transportation played in structural racism a generation ago. very intentionally building highways. So unlike the Rondo scenario where 94 needed to go somewhere and it happened to displace a community, it wasn't intentional, it wasn't necessarily malicious. I think, in retrospect, we can look at it in a very different light and work to resolve that. In Baltimore, highways were built with the intention of dividing black and white communities. And Baltimore is not the only example of that. So, I would say, the first place to start is let's call the question. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the role that transportation infrastructure has played in this issue that, despite being a generation old, we're still grappling with. That's step zero. We need to call the question, we need to sit in rooms like this and then have the hard conversations around what that looks like. Then we need to think about the future. For us, transportation is all about moving people to work. It's all about access to jobs. And the triangle of affordable or workforce housing, our workforce generally, and transit, how we move people around our system, that's how we're going to thrive as a market. We are enjoying unprecedentedly low unemployment rates, but a looming talent deficit in the face. And Will talked about how people get to work. If we're going to continue to thrive as a region, we need to solve for some of this. We need to create more options, more opportunity for, I'm looking at Julie Brecky in the audience, to get the folks that she's preparing at Hired to work. So that they can work in Minnetonka, or they can work in downtown Minneapolis, or they can work on the east side of St. Paul. And that's what this conversation is about. It's about access to jobs, it's about workforce, it's about our economic vitality, and that's how we're going to win. And questions around race and questions around the structural elements that the transportation have played are going to be critical to overcoming some of the challenges that we face as advocates in this space.
Well, thank you. Will you all please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists? That's great. So we have time for just a couple of questions. If anybody has been, and the hands are going up, Rachel's running.
Thank you. One of the things that hasn't been brought up is subsidies. There's heavy subsidies in public transit. I think the North Star Rail, for example, has subsidies up as much as $30 per ride. If people were paying what it actually costs, there'd be a considerable change in ridership, I think. And to be fair, if the $8,500 number that you quoted was subsidized to an equal extent, I think many of us would have a free car. So how do you respond to that? Will there be a time when the subsidies can be eliminated?
Thanks for the question. It's an important question. The subsidy in the car actually goes the other way. If that $8,500 were fully paid for, it would probably be twice that, because no one pays when they get on their local streets. We don't pay when we get on our county roads. We don't pay for a lot of the parking that we use. Those are collected and paid for in other ways, but you don't pay every time you get on. The single best indication of that is the fact that when Jonathan tells about the biggest investment that we've made in transportation in a decade in the state, it's general fund revenue that's going to state highways. General fund revenue, not user fees, not car taxes, general fund revenues that are going to the state highways. Because why? They don't pay for themselves, so they have to go to general fund revenues. We have a multi-billion dollar maintenance deficit on our state and county highway system. Why? Because they don't pay for themselves. If they were a private entity, they would never run up that kind of multi-billion dollar deficit because they would go out of business. So does that mean that we don't need to look at North Star costs? Absolutely not. If I were doing it, I would be doing it differently, believe me. But the idea that somehow transit is subsidized and everything else is not is just flat wrong, as long as we're being blunt on a Tuesday morning. And so the question, I think, is how do we have a state that works together? I don't complain about the subsidies that it takes to to maintain Highway 61 north of Grand Marais because I never go north of Grand Marais, right? But it's part of the state. It's good for me as a Minnesotan that that highway works. So I'm happy to pay for it. But it doesn't pay for itself, and let's not pretend it does.
Thank you for your comments this morning. I have a statement and then a comment. A statement is I work for a commercial real estate firm, and every day we're helping companies make decisions about where to locate their businesses and so forth. One of the #1 issues is labor, and transportation for that labor is extraordinarily important. So we're hearing companies all the time saying we need to be located on a transit line, multiple transit lines, bus, because we have to have access to the workforce today and into the future. So as those companies are making decisions, it's an extraordinarily important component of how we have built out or will build out the transportation system going forward and the options available. My question is related to the Federal Reserve Bank, the Minneapolis Fed's Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute that was launched early in 2017. Neil Kashkari and the other researchers at the Fed are conducting research on the gap, the persistent gap that exists between the opportunity gap between people of color and the rest of us. And so do you know to the extent to which they're looking at transportation issues? Have you had any input on that? Do you have any thoughts or comments related to that? That would be helpful. Thank you.
I haven't talked to the Federal Reserve on that particular topic.
But it's a common finding that employers, Amazon's in the headlines, but every day we hear from employers saying, I need to be on a transit line because otherwise my folks can't get to work. One of my board members is a Washington County commissioner, and she's very, very proud of the work they've done to redevelop the old State Farm campus in Woodbury, right? And so there's a new hotel open there and another one about to open. And she was talking with the hotel manager, I'm not going to name the hotel, but he was saying, I can't get people out here to work, right? And he's in trouble because they have a contract with TRIA, the clinic across the parking lot, and the TRIA patients can recover in their hotel. They don't have staff because why? They can't get people to work there because the Gold Line isn't built yet. Now, they're excited about the Gold Line coming, but it's going to be a little bit. So this is a real challenge. It's a real challenge for our economic growth and a city that literally works.
I want to add just one thing, and this is outside my area of expertise, so I'm just going to mention it, but housing is very tied in with these transit accessibility issues. I think Minneapolis, St. Paul has, or at least Minneapolis has the tightest rental availability right now in the entire nation.
Yes.
And most of that is now no longer affordable because we are such a desired destination. That means people have to go further and further out to find a place to live that's affordable or that is appropriate for maybe a larger family. It's hard to find rental that's more than 1 or 2 bedrooms. And if you're further and further out, of course, you don't have as much access to transportation. And when you're a younger person or a young family, you often have the most challenging structure for using transit successfully. You know, when I had a young kid at home, it was hard to get up and get organized, and you know, somebody gets dropped off at daycare or waiting for the nanny to come. Well, where does the nanny come from? She has to use transit. It's hard. I don't ever want to represent using transit as easy for everyone. It's easy for me right now. Nobody's left at home except my husband and I. You know, but for my father and mother, as they were getting older, transit was not available. It's got to be made easier, and housing is a piece of that, and it's certainly important for the equity conversation.
Should we take one last question?
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for this conference. As I study cities around the country, the big game is transit and transportation. So Minneapolis, I'm Susie Nicassi, and I'm on the city council in Northfield, Minnesota. My representative, David Bly here. 60% of Rice County commute to Hennepin or Ramsey for work, and we have no public transit south of the Met Council. Could you talk about intercity regional transportation. Anybody that commutes from the south knows that we all meet for coffee at the corner of 94 and 35W every morning and evening. I was late getting here for that reason. Has that been part of the conversation, beyond the Met Council boundary? Thank you.
It's a great question. Thanks for asking. A couple of thoughts. The Minnesota Department of Transportation, and I have to say they're taking their mission and their name very, very seriously these days. They really are a Department of Transportation, and they have done excellent work on statewide transit and rail plans, passenger rail plans. It's a question of resources, so they have done a lot of listening around the state, and Rice County, Northfield to one side. Everywhere that the state goes, the state Department of Transportation goes in the state, they hear a desire and a demand for better rural and greater Minnesota transit. People going to work in Marshall and Hutchinson and Austin need transit. Senior citizens going to increasingly far-flung regional hospitals in far northwest need better transit. Students going to school in MnSCU systems need transit. If anything, I would say, based on my participation in these processes, the need in greater Minnesota is even more than it is here in the region, because we have a pretty good system to start with in the region, and that's not the case in some of greater Minnesota counties. So there's a need both for transit within greater Minnesota, just back and forth, and then also from greater Minnesota into Minneapolis. Several years ago, Jonathan and I collaborated to commission a statewide poll of attitudes about transit in Minnesota. Transit in the cities scored higher in greater Minnesota than it did in a lot of parts of the city, particularly in the suburbs. Because why? And we interviewed a couple of these people in real time after they'd, answered the regular kind of rote questions. And they said, oh, when I come to Minneapolis, of course I park in Big Lake and take the North Star in, because that just makes sense. Back to the gentleman, should we be paying for that ride? That's an interesting question. They get it. It makes sense to drive to Big Lake and then come in on the train. A state that works makes it possible to get back and forth from greater Minnesota into the cities and back out again. Marvin Windows trucks come through the cities. Congestion in the cities doesn't do them any good. They're like, please get those people into trains so that our trucks can come through. That's a compelling argument. So I think that, once again, taking the perspective not of should we be paying for this little chunk because I don't personally use it, to what's good for the state. Does it help the state work as a whole state? Does it help Marvin get its products to Chicago? Does it help folks in Marshall get to work so that our agricultural system is strong? Those are the right questions that we need to ask.
Great. Daniel? There it is.
Let's thank all of our speakers for doing such a wonderful job.
Well, I want to thank Neuger for putting this together, because this is such an important conversation, and I just really appreciate it. So let's thank Neuger.
That wraps up today's program, so thank you for all being here. There are surveys on your table, so we encourage you to fill out the survey before you leave. Thank you all for coming.